Kelly Thibault. I'm with the New Jersey Center for Associated Disorders, and I'm your organizer this evening. I apologize for the slight delay in the start of this. We had a couple of technical difficulties, which we've worked out. And so I'll be your organizer this evening and like to welcome you to our webinar on understanding and responding to behavioral difficulties and rage behaviors in children and adolescents. All participants are muted, so if you have a question, type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may post a question during the webinar, but Dr. Ewbank will be answering questions only at the end of the webinar. We will get to as many questions as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar discussion board. This discussion board will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would just like to hear it again, an archived version will be posted to the website shortly. When you exit the webinar, there will be a brief exit survey that we'd like you to fill out. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the program coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thank you, Kelly, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar series. For those of you new to our webinar series, I'd like to share with you that we launched our series in January 2008. Tonight's webinar is the 24th in our series, and to date we have registered over 4,000 individuals for our various webinars from all over the U.S. and Canada and as far away as Australia. So needless to say, we are quite excited about the growing interest in our series. Now, to tonight's program. Our presenter for the evening is Dr. Sean Ewbank, who received his undergraduate degree from the University of California at San Diego and his graduate degree in clinical psychology from Rutgers University. Dr. Ewbank is a doctoral-level therapist with almost 10 years' experience in the field of behavioral health, working with children and families living with OCD, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, anxiety disorders, and rage. In particular, he has specialized in behavioral and crisis management for children, adolescents, and adults. He was a student clinician in our TS clinic at Rutgers University Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology for 4 years before leaving to develop specialized expertise in treating college-age populations at UCLA's Counseling and Psychological Services. Now he's back on the East Coast, a therapist in a Manhattan private practice, and has returned to our Tourette syndrome clinical program at Rutgers, where he provides psychotherapy and clinical supervision. Additionally, he trains and supervises graduate students in cognitive behavior therapy in the Rutgers Clinical Psychology doctoral program. So it is with great pleasure that I turn tonight's presentation over to Dr. Ewbank.
Hello, everyone. Again, we apologize for the delays. To start out, I would just like to thank the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome for having me talk to everyone tonight, and also just for the marvelous work that they do for Tourette Syndrome around the state of New Jersey and around the country and even worldwide now. This webinar series is a fantastic thing that they do. I would like to especially thank Faith, Kelly, and Marty, who have been instrumental in putting together this series and also helping me with my talk and working out all the technical kinks. With that said, I will be presenting on understanding and responding to explosive outbursts in children and adolescents. As you guys can see, I simplified the title slightly, thinking that rage attacks and behavioral difficulties, for the purposes of this talk, could be described well under that single term, explosive outbursts. I just wanted to touch on some of the clinical work I do. Marty did a great job sort of letting you guys know some of my history coming up in the Tourette syndrome program at Rutgers University. So I'm in my 5th year here at this program. just a brief mention of what we do. We work with families with Tourette syndrome, children, adolescents, and adults in the evaluation and the cognitive behavioral treatment for Tourette syndrome and for all of the associated disorders. So that's your OCD, your ADHD, your behavioral problems, such as these explosive outbursts, your anxiety disorders, and depressive disorders. And one of the really unique features of this program is it's a training program for doctoral candidates in clinical psychology, and it really is sort of probably the only training program in the country that really isn't research focused, but focusing on training sort of future psychologists in how to work with Tourette syndrome and some of the complexities. So it's a privilege to work here. In addition to that, I'm also in private practice in Manhattan. Kelly, I'm on the third slide. If I just realized you're having to switch my slides for me. In my private practice, I do a lot of the similar work that I do at the Tourette syndrome program in evaluating and treating various psychological disorders with specialties in Tourette's, but also working on a lot of other things. If you wanted more information about that, you are welcome to see my website, drshawnewbank.com. And with that, to begin the presentation, I just wanted to name a few goals for tonight. My overall goal is really to provide knowledge that will allow teachers and parents and clinicians and other adults to be more confident, more thoughtful, and more effective in decreasing explosive outbursts in children and adolescents. And so I've named these three goals to pursue that end. First is to explain explosive outbursts in a way that encourages adult efforts to understand the causes of explosive outbursts. So I really want to go beyond the incident of a single outburst and really try to understand the phenomenon and learn how to do that with individual kids who are all very different from one another. Secondly, I want to encourage proactive planning in response to selected target behaviors or selected target environments. By that, what I mean is I am going to be encouraging everyone here that if we want to decrease explosive outbursts, we have to make plans in advance of these outbursts happening, and we have to be very selective. We want to select certain very limited settings and limited behaviors to plan what we're going to do, and then increase the areas that we target over time. And lastly, I want to suggest more ideal approaches for changing behaviors and for decreasing rage. So with those goals in mind, I'd just like to start with what is an explosive outburst. So an explosive outburst, also known as a rage attack, especially in the Tourette syndrome community, is really just, to me, an age-inappropriate tantrum. So somebody who is tantruming in a way that makes them look younger than they actually are. And it really has three key ingredients. Those are verbal behaviors, physical behaviors, and or refusal behaviors. So if you look at your picture on your left, you have this young man who's showing a lot of verbal behaviors. He's shouting, he might be cursing, making threats or insults, and he's also raising his hand. And I'd sort of lump the nonverbal gesture into verbal behaviors. In comparison with our green adolescent on the right, who is showing both verbal and physical behaviors. So not only is he yelling, but if you look behind him, you can see that he is started on with some property damage. Within physical behaviors, I also want to include things like hitting and shoving and throwing things. So pretty straightforward. As far as refusal behaviors, that's just when the child will not do something, say homework or whatnot. So for an example, picture a child, Tommy. And Tommy has been asked to do math problems. Now initially Tommy refuses simply by doing nothing, or maybe telling the teacher he won't do it. Now when the teacher tries to convince Tommy, he escalates his behaviors to cursing, a little bit of yelling. Now in response to his cursing, the teacher asks Tommy to go to the principal's office. Tommy, however, refuses to leave the room and instead begins insulting his classmates, yelling even more, and then rips up his work and even throws his desk down on the floor. So now in a short time, a lot of problematic behaviors have occurred. So the question here is, what do we do to change things for Tommy, for his teacher, and for the whole class? If we want to start down the road to change these behaviors, there's something else we need to know. So the upcoming sentence is the most important piece of information in this entire talk. And here it is. It is unlikely that your child's behavior will change if it is not first understood. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take our example of Tommy in math class. Based on the information in this story, we have almost nothing that can help us. We know that he's not doing his math, and he's refused, and that things have gone downhill from there. But if we haven't figured out why Tommy isn't doing his math, we're missing some crucial pieces of information, and we certainly don't understand his outburst behaviors. So let's get to work to start our understanding. I've narrowed this down to 2 possible reasons why a child might have behavioral problems. So first up, reason 1, the child wants to misbehave. Reason 2 is the child lacks the skills to meet expectations. So we're going to look at both possibilities and come up with solutions to each one. But first, I'd like to give an example, and we should be on the slide of the screaming 2-year-old. So our case study is the screaming 2-year-old. I happen to be the proud uncle of a 2-and-a-half-year-old niece named Charlotte. Now, Charlie is extremely cute most of the time. However, in the
could you speak up just a little?
No problem. So, however, in this displayed representation, she is somewhat less cute. Is that better, Kelly?
Yes.
Okay. So what happened with Charlie here? Well, it just turned out Charlie asked for some cheese. Only problem was that there wasn't any cheese in the house. Now forget about that trip to the store because she wants cheese right now. When circumstantially no cheese is delivered right now, Charlie quickly entered into tantrum mode. For her, tantrum mode involves screaming, stomping, hitting, throwing, and yes, this kid is a biter. Now let's consider our possible explanations for this ensuing tantrum. So we have reason 1. She wants to tantrum. Reason 2. She is lacking skills in cognitive flexibility, frustration tolerance, and communication. Now what do I mean by that? Well, let's take cognitive flexibility. We know that 2-year-olds like things to be predictable and structured with no hiccups. Number 2, frustration tolerance. 2-year-olds, they're actually notorious for crying and screaming over matters we adults consider trivial. And communication. She does know the word cheese, but Mommy's explanation of why she doesn't have any cheese and how she could get some later really seemed to fall on deaf ears. Because probably for a 2-year-old, those concepts are a little bit complex, especially when they're upset. Now, we know all this about 2-year-olds. In fact, there's a good chance that most of the audience didn't sign up for this webinar for tips on how to manage their 2-year-old. So that brings us to the real question. Why would an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old, next slide, Kelly, or a 16-year-old act like a toddler? Reason 1, the child wants to misbehave. Now, if that's a reason, we have to look at our first solution, which is we motivate the child to behave. Which brings us to a question. How in the world do we motivate a difficult child? You see down there reason 2, but we're going to come back to that. So how do you motivate a difficult child? Next slide. Here's the quick formula of how to motivate a difficult child. I spent 4 years between college and graduate student in jobs that focused on motivational-based modification and crisis intervention. So believe me when I say I have expertise and a basis in this work. So here's the short version of how it's done. If you want to motivate a difficult child, you implement consistent and immediate reinforcers for appropriate behaviors. Now, this can be an especially good strategy for an ADHD individual. They're not very motivated by long-term rewards, but if you give them something they get right then and there, that can be really quite effective. So here's how it works. If you're going to implement this sort of reinforcement plan, first you want to determine a specific problem to change. So in the case of Tommy, you probably want him to do more math problems. Number 2, you want to identify a positive change you would like to see in the situation. So him doing maybe 3 more math problems or 5 more math problems, something that's specific. And then you provide frequent, immediate rewards when there's a positive change observed. So he picks up his pencil, he gets a token. he does doing a problem number 1, he gets an extra token. When he finishes a problem, he gets another one. So you might, if you really want to be effective here, you might stand over Tommy and keep the reinforcement coming. Now, number 4, this is the optional step, is you consider brief, non-harmful punishment when specified negative behavior occurs. So if Tommy decides to curse in this situation, then maybe he has to take a brief time out for a minute in the back of the room and return to his desk. So that's brief, non-harmful. Now, this sort of solution of how to motivate a difficult child can work really well, especially with easy children. They respond very well to motivation. But to me, there's an inherent problem with these motivational strategies. So next slide. Now, I've worked with a lot of children, and I happen to believe that all children want to do well. They'll do well whenever they can. Now, when we begin introducing rewards, we're fighting against this internal drive to do well and teaching kids something else. We're telling them that they should do well to get something out of it, something external. So in the picture on the right, we're holding the phone up for the puppy. The puppy will do a lot of things for that. And our rat on the left, press the lever for food. So we're teaching the kids what we want them to do instead of looking for intrinsic motivation to do well. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't sometimes very useful. It can actually work incredibly well, but it's usually not my first choice. But let's look at this middle picture here. This is where our problems really emerge with our explosive kids. In this slide, the little girl did go to her chair to take her short time out. In fact, your run-of-the-mill, non-explosive, outburst-prone child tends to be pretty compliant with consequences. They might not like it, but they tend to do it. However, consider the example in the math class. Tommy refused to go to the principal's office. With explosive children, we often run into trouble because they have the tendency not to respond well to immediate consequences. On the other hand, they actually tend to increase outburst behaviors in the face of consequences and other motivational strategies. So, if motivational strategies have continued not to work, next slide, then we are back to the drawing board. So let's go back to the question we asked earlier and look at it from another angle. Next slide. So back to understanding explosive outbursts. And again, why would an 8-year-old, 13-year-old, 16-year-old, etc. act like a toddler? So reason 1 and solution 1 aren't working. Then that leaves us with reason 2. The child lacks the skills to meet expectations. And what's our solution here? We need to find ways to teach skills and increase the child's chances for success. Now, before we can teach these skills, we're kind of going to need to know what skills are lacking. It's hard to say because so many kids are different what skills are lacking, but I think from a fundamental level, we assume that there's some sort of developmental delay going on. So it's not that they can't have a skill, it's just that they're delayed in gaining this skill, and that's why they have an age-inappropriate reaction. So what are these missing skills then? Some common categories. Next slide is what are these missing skills? Common missing skills are cognitive flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving, communication, social skills. So these are sort of our broad categories. But we probably are going to want to be even a little bit more specific than that. So next slide, we have identity skill deficits made easy. Luckily for me, this process has been made really easy. In this short talk, there'd be no way I could go through the variety of different skills that could be missing in a kid who has explosive outbursts. But Ross Green, a doctor at Harvard, has already done this for me in his creation of a measure called the Assessment of Lagging Skills and Unsolved Problems. He calls it the ALSUP. And it can be acquired readily online at a website, www.livesinthebalance.org. So I'm referencing you to this because this is a great tool for parents, teachers, medical and mental health professionals alike to begin to identify skills deficits in a way to decrease outburst behaviors. So on the next slide we see, this is the first half of the ALSUP, and I know probably for a lot of you it doesn't come in all that clearly but I just wanted to show you kind of what it looked like. So this is what is called the lagging skills section. So again, Ross Green uses the term lagging skills, suggesting that there's a developmental delay. These are skills a child is capable of gaining, but they don't happen to have yet. So they're behind. It's harder for them compared to other kids, but most children have the ability to learn and improve on these lagging areas. So when we're looking at the ALSUP, I'd recommend anybody with a child with explosive outbursts is looking to fill this ALSUP out. And when I say fill it out, I'm not talking about sort of going through it in about a minute, but filling it out is actually a process that you probably want to take 15 to 20 minutes to do. So you gather all the adults who know the child well and have experienced them in the situations of outbursts, and you begin a discussion about what's going on and try to make the ratings and take notes around the different areas, but you try to come up with some things that are going on. So take Tommy in the math class. Maybe he isn't doing his math homework, and after you look at a bunch of different things he's not doing, you start to narrow down on skills number 3 and 4. He has difficulty persisting on challenging or tedious tasks, and he has a poor sense of time. So now we're starting to get to know Tommy a little bit better. So next slide. Now, as useful as these deficits are in explaining the problem to gain, let's see, here we are. Once the skills have been determined, we're in a better position to make useful plans to decrease outbursts. But I have a warning for you guys, and that is beware of the motivation trap. So what is it like to try to motivate a child who lacks the skills to meet expectations? This is a popular analogy in the Tourette syndrome community, but it is much like trying to ask somebody who is in a wheelchair to climb a flight of stairs. If the child doesn't have the skills to meet the expectations and we are trying to motivate them to do it, we are really asking for something that we cannot achieve. And this is not a good position to be into. In fact, it tends to lead to more outbursts. So let's even give an example about this. So for parents now, let's say it's nearing bedtime and your child Betty is watching television. Now from completing the ALSUP, we've learned that Betty has difficulties with transitions and with shifting from one mindset to another. We know that bedtime is a big outburst time, but we also know that we really want Betty to brush her teeth. Now, as a parent, it's difficult not to move right into motivational mode, but we happen to know that every night we ask Betty to brush her teeth, and that results in an explosive outburst. And so, knowing that she has these lagging skills, the direction on Betty to brush teeth while watching TV might not be reasonable. Or at least it may only accomplish an outburst and no teeth brushing. So what's our alternative here? Our alternative is proactive planning. So next slide. With these skills identified, we are ready to begin planning together to decrease explosive outbursts. Once again, we're not doing this alone. We're trying to gather knowledgeable adults to kind of come together on what to do. So let's start out with step 1. We want to select a behavior to target. So how are we going to select which behaviors we want to target to decrease explosive outbursts? Again, we have the ALSUP, but we have a new section, the unsolved problem section, which is on the next slide. So here it is. Now, we have a lot of different problem situations. We have situations for home, we have situations for school, and we have situations that you can actually fill in. Now let's think about Betty, who's watching television instead of brushing her teeth. We know that bedtime is a problem area, so we probably scored that one high. Now, it's ideal to have as specific a problem as possible, so we can actually write more details into the margin of this ALSUP or on another piece of paper. It could be for Betty that multiple tasks are hard around bedtime: going upstairs, brushing her teeth, picking out tomorrow's clothes, setting alarms, and getting into bed. These are all problems to solve. If we have picked bedtime as our area to reduce outbursts, we need to consider each area separately. Now, we thought teeth brushing was a problem for Betty, but it could turn out that the transition from TV to upstairs is also suspect. So right now we're considering the whole area of bedtime and figuring out what to do. So next slide. So we want to try to understand what causes the outburst in the selected area. So for step 2, we have 2 pieces of information that we're trying to get. First, we have our understanding of the child's lagging skills that has already come from our experience of the child and been better defined by the top section of the ALSUP. Second, we have the child themselves, and their perspective can be a crucial piece of information. So let's take Betty. Do we really know why she won't brush her teeth? Maybe she doesn't like the feel of the bristles on her teeth. Maybe she wants to finish the show she's watching. Maybe she thinks she should go to bed an hour earlier. Maybe she doesn't like being in the bathroom while her younger brother is brushing his teeth. Unless we ask Betty for more specifics, we are unlikely to know for sure what is going on. Now, what happens if we ask Betty, right as she's beginning an outburst, what's going on? Probably not much. This is probably not the best time because it's not being proactive. If she's in the middle of an outburst, I'm not so sure Betty's going to communicate well. But if she's having this outburst almost nightly, when asked to stop watching television and brush her teeth, we can ask at any time we want when she's not having an outburst, like in the morning or in the afternoon. So to ask Betty, we say something like, Betty, I've noticed that you get upset when you're watching television and I ask you to brush your teeth and get ready for bed. What's happening? So now Betty has the space to answer the question. We listen and we ask lots of follow-up questions to get as many details as possible so we can understand her behavior. Because remember, if we do not understand the behavior, we are unlikely to change it. So next slide. So now if we've gained a better understanding of the behavior from the ALSUP and from Betty, we have 3 possible solutions to select from. So solution path 1 is to modify the environment so that the child is not faced with the problem. Solution path 2 is to collaborate with the child on the planned solution. And solution path 3 is to accept that explosive outbursts are likely to occur in this problem area. Okay, so let's go over each of these solutions one at a time. Next slide. So path 1, modify the environment so that the child is not faced with the problem. So what I really mean by this is we're actually lowering our expectations on the child. Now this could mean a lot of things. Some of the things it could mean is that we actually give them less to do, less homework, less chores, less morning responsibilities. We tend to accommodate their requests. We're doing things to lower explosive outbursts. So clearly this isn't the best permanent solution because it doesn't teach any particular skills. What it does is it decreases the likelihood of outbursts and creates a more ideal environment to learn skills. So if outbursts are happening multiple times per day, we need to get the number of outbursts down because it is extremely hard to teach a child skills when they're in the middle of an outburst minefield all the time. Think about the example of Tommy, who did not want to do his math problems. Lowering expectations might look like this. Teacher says, Tommy, why aren't you working on your math? Tommy, I don't want to work on my math. Teacher, okay. And that's it. The expectation is lowered for now. The teacher simply agreed that, if he's not going to want to work on math, he doesn't have to do it. Now, what good is it to allow Tommy to choose not to do his math? Sometimes choosing solution path 1 eases the tension so we can pick where we want to employ solution path 2 because we can't collaborate on all problems at once. So path 2 is collaborate with the child on the planned solution. So how do we do this? Once again, we're actually going to turn to Ross Green and paperwork he has available at the same website, livesinthebalance.org. It's in the paperwork question. He has something called the Plan B flowchart. This option turns out to be a big thing. The Plan B flowchart will help solve problems and teach skills to a child at the same time. So if a child can learn to generate solutions to skill-based problems, then they can become an active agent in gaining skills. So on the next slide, let's take a look at this Plan B flowchart and talk a little bit about it. Now, the unfortunate thing about this slide is that it could easily be a 2-hour talk all on its own. Or even better, it would be multiple 20-minute talks on a weekly basis as adults are doing their best to solve problems with this method. So by that I mean we learn how to fill out the Plan B flowchart, and then we check in about it, and then we learn more about how to do it as we get better and better at doing it, because we don't expect perfection the first time here. This is not easy stuff. In fact, a lot of clinicians, teachers, and parents have had unsuccessful experiences with this method simply because they lack proper coaching about how to execute it. So now for a moment, I want to challenge those of you in the audience who have read The Explosive Child or tried collaborative problem solving, these are Ross Greene's methods, and been frustrated by the results or the lack of results. This is not easy stuff to carry out, and for really challenging children, it can take a lot of thoughtful guidance from clinicians who are both skilled and knowledgeable with these methods. So hang in there. All right, let's talk about the steps here. So first step is you're naming the unsolved problem. We've sort of talked about that. But next, you want to put an adult who's going to take the lead on this plan. So they're making sure that whatever the plan is, that it's being carried out. That's our second box. Third box is to identify the kids' concerns. Now, we just talked about how to do this a little bit with Betty. The key here is to make sure we thoroughly understand their concerns and that we are what they call empathic listeners. So we've heard the child, we've let them know that we've heard them, and even if their concern is extremely different from our point of view, we're willing to listen and take it in. So for example, teacher says, Tommy, I noticed that you stopped working on your math. What's happening? Tommy says, well, I don't want to do them. Teacher, well, why don't you want to do them? Tommy, I can never finish them in time before we do something else. Teacher, so you don't do your math problems because it's hard to finish in time. Tommy, yeah, I don't have enough time. Okay, so there it is. That's Tommy's concern. He's worried that he won't finish his math problem, so he doesn't even start. And so the teacher kind of repeats that concern to him, make sure that he knows that he's heard. And then the next step, next box, is that the teacher's concerns are identified. So the teacher, that's easy. She says, well, Tommy, I'm worried that if you don't practice your math in class, that you will not do well on the test. There you go. Now we have both concerns on the table, which brings us to the invitation step. So an invitation step is basically inviting the child to work on problem solving around this problem. And an invitation can look like this. The teacher says, Tommy, let's think about how we can solve this problem together. Do you have any ideas? So we're inviting Tommy to start working on the solution. And Tommy and the teacher can work together to find a solution that works for everyone. Now, the solution could be anything as long as it addresses both the teacher's concerns and Tommy's concerns. So it might be that Tommy gets extra time while the other kids move on to reading. It might be that Tommy has less problems to do in math. It might be that he gets extra help while the other kids are working. The important thing is that it addresses both concerns. Now, if we're just starting this problem solving with Tommy, he might not be that good at it. So when we ask him, do you have any ideas of how to solve it? At first, he might not have any. So we're ready to supply him with different ideas and see what he thinks. There are no guarantees that this process will work the first time we do it. More realistically, there is often going to need to be multiple discussions for a single problem between both Tommy and his teacher before they can find a solution that works. Now, all these discussions are practicing problem solving. Both the teacher and Tommy are practicing this problem-solving method, and they're becoming better at it over time. And as Tommy becomes better at problem solving, he's actually gaining in lagging skills by not only engaging in these discussions instead of having outbursts, but also by putting plans in place that help him. So that is our Plan B flowchart. Next, we get to solution path 3. So we accept that explosive outbursts are likely in this problem area. If there is no plan in place along solution path 1 or 2, then we can anticipate an explosive outburst is going to incur. What can you do to stop an explosive outburst that has begun? Now, this is a big question, and I get it a lot from parents. And I hate to say it, but there's usually very little that you can do. Once an outburst has started, oftentimes it's going to kind of play out and end in its own time. So my advice in this situation is two things. One, we want to try to maintain safety, and we want to try to our best to limit the interactions with the child until they calm down. So as long as the child is safe, we're trying to keep our distance or move other people out of the room, move other children out of the room if there's a safety concern. So this is our solution when we don't have any other plan in place. That's why we like path 1 or path 2 as therapists as opposed to more outbursts. We really want to get that number down. Now, so for those of you who are doing this work, it can be really challenging. So a question a lot of people ask is, when do you seek therapeutic support? When do you find somebody else who has more expertise in this to help out? So you might seek therapeutic support if outbursts are creating a frequent strain on the family or the class. So everybody is being affected and really having a really tough time. Or if your attempts to involve your child in communicating to solve problems are continually not successful. You're trying to teach them problem solving, but it doesn't seem to be working. Or if there are safety concerns. If a child is being unsafe, then you really want support in there right away. Or lastly, if you just think it would be useful to have extra guidance and support. Now, from my perspective, if you want to know what to look for in a therapist, there's a couple of really key features for a therapist. For children and adolescents with Tourette syndrome and behavioral problems, I especially recommend therapists who specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy with children. So Tourette syndrome is a very neurological disorder, and a lot of the other things that go along with it tend to be neurological in basis. So I really look for a therapist who has a very solution-oriented approach, trying to decrease the behaviors that you see. I further recommend a therapist who works with parents and teachers as well as children, not just the child alone. So if you have a therapist who is doing anger management with the child or stress relaxation, and they're meeting with the child for 45 minutes a week and then sending them on their way, I would suggest with the explosive children that we are speaking about that is probably not enough to help them. They're not going to be able to leave the therapist's office and then do well on their own. They need actual help and intervention from the adults in their life while the behavioral problems are occurring. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening, and I am happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you are, because we have a lot of them.
Okay.
And the other thing I have to say is that some of them are quite lengthy, so I'm going to try and encapsulate them as best I can and cover as many as I can. Okay, so I didn't hear you mention anything about any kind of supplements or anything, and I was trying to pay attention to that. So I have a question about magnesium. Is that anything that you could address, or you really don't want to touch?
It's not really in my area of expertise to touch. With a lot of the supplements, I think the problem from the perspective of a clinical psychologist is that it's not only outside of the scope of the research we might look at, but a lot of times there does not tend to be as much research. So I know more about kind of pharmaceutical medications. Well, that's not my area of specialty, but supplements, I mean, from my experience, some parents will really swear by various supplements, and some really don't think much of them. I think different children are very different, so something that works incredibly well for one child might not work at all for another, and for another it might cause them odd side effects that are problematic. So.
Okay, fair enough. I just didn't know. I thought I might have missed it, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to touch on it if you could. All right, so I have a question about a 10-year-old. How do you explain to a 10-year-old about why he's the way he is, why he explodes and calls mommy names and hits? He doesn't understand, and, you know, so how do we handle, you know, that when he really has no understanding of it?
Yeah, so I think one thing I didn't say in my talk is for a lot of kids who have explosive outbursts, that I think a lot of the listeners know, at the end of the outburst, there's a lot of times a lot of remorse and guilt. So these are children who feel that they don't have control over their behavior and they don't really know how to understand it. It almost seems like it's not them in those moments, but yet it's happening a lot. And the way that I would try to explain it is to, if it's a Tourette syndrome child, I try to normalize it as something that really happens to children in general, to children with ADHD, to children with Tourette syndrome. But even better is if you're offering them an explanation and you're also moving in the direction of a plan, saying, you know, we are thinking that there's some things that are going to be helpful to you, and we are working on trying to find ways to make things easier. So I almost think sometimes reassurance at first might be more important than an overly complicated explanation, and it sort of depends on the 10-year-old. I mean, certain kids are really pretty savvy at understanding what happens and why. So you sort of have to meet them where they're at.
Yeah, but when you get buy-in from the kid to participate in a program like this, then obviously there's more chance of success too, right?
Yes, it is ideal to have the child have buy-in. I don't think that's as necessary at first. If you're really going in the direction of the program like this, the first thing you're looking to do as an adult in the child's life is to find ways to lower the amount of explosive outbursts that there are. So this is a lot of that work where you might lower the expectations. So if they're having less outbursts because you found ways to make things a little bit easier, then their buy-in is probably already increasing. And even with the problem solving, I mean, you can explain to them exactly what you're doing, but even if they said that they weren't on board, I think it's beneficial for it just to be a different way to approach the child and their problems. So you're viewing the problem with a different set of lenses. You're interacting with the child in a different way that's actually helpful and is addressing their skills, whether or not they have totally agreed to it or it's just something that you're doing to change. Any child will like to have less outbursts, if that makes sense.
Okay. I have a question about a child who has and ideas to motivate, regarding motivational ideas. The problem is that this child has some OCD. So when you use motivation, she becomes fixated on it or whatever it is, whether it's stickers or filling out the chart, or it becomes all about that and that rather than what it's the purpose of it. Are there any suggestions for how to handle that?
Yeah, so that can be really challenging. I mean, as my talk touched on, I think with certain children, strategies that work too much with motivational systems can be problematic and can actually lead to more blowouts. And with an OCD child who's really gets stuck up on their motivational program, it might not be the best approach to use with that child. And I'm assuming in this case it's a child where maybe their explosive behaviors are more problematic than their OCD behaviors. So you're not looking for treatment for OCD until you can actually get the behaviors down too. And if the motivational approaches are not working, then you have to take a different approach.
Yeah, I think in this particular case that it seems to be that the child only has OCD. And using those types of motivation, she becomes, fixated on the sticker or the prize or the
I understand.
The reward.
If I do understand correctly, I work with a lot of children with OCD, and I occasionally will put a motivation system in place to get them to do the cognitive behavioral therapy work to decrease the OCD. But I generally think that that's not a good idea because you can really run into problems with it. I would prefer to motivate the child to work on their OCD because having less OCD would be helpful for their lives, and to motivate them along those lines, and then have them actually doing the different exposure homeworks, the work that you do to lower OCD, have them doing that without a clear extrinsic reward or reward program. Now, with children where that doesn't work, I've used reward programs, and it sometimes becomes a mixed bag because then, in a way, if you have a reward program, I mean, I have a case right now where the child is somewhat motivated to continue having OCD symptoms because they kind of like having the reward program. So if they get better, then how are they going to get the reward?
Yeah. Okay. Have a question about two kids, brothers, 9 and 11, and the oldest seems to target the younger with aggression and physical outbursts. They're seeing a therapy. They're seeing a therapist, rather. But the question is, why do kids choose a person as a target? And in some instances, they've also targeted, a parent. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say, and then I'll take a couple stabs at reasons, but the first thing I'll say is that there could be a lot of different reasons, and so this might be one of those opportunities to try to use your understanding of the child, their skills that they're lacking for this older child, and to try to get some information from them. But that said, I mean, a couple of potential reasons are, I mean, a lot of children with outburst behaviors really look to have outbursts in safe settings and in settings where they feel okay, and that more often than not happens to be the home. And very often it's one of the parents or both of the parents and the siblings who really kind of take the brunt of things. And it can really vary within families, but I think that that's sort of a place where explosive outbursts can occur, and it sort of becomes a pattern of the way to handle problems. And another thing I've seen, since we just mentioned OCD, is that sometimes certain anxieties or obsessional thinking can locate around individuals and sort of cause these negative reactions. So maybe this younger child, for potentially arbitrary reasons, cues off OCD. I've seen things like, they're dirty because they don't wash their hands enough, or the things they eat are gross, or any sort of reasons. And that can be a trigger for behavioral problems. One thing I will say is it would be important to really try to sort that out and to figure out what it is, because that would be really good information to have.
Okay. I have a question from a teacher who works with preschool autistic children. And this child's behavior is maintained by attention. He screams, cries, will try to hit anyone he can get attention from, from the staff or from the teacher. And she'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, so very young and children further down the autistic spectrum are certainly not my specialty area, but this might, in my mind, be a category of children who really extremely behavioral and even motivational responses to basically have positive behavior would be indicated. And so by that I mean that this would be the case. We're putting some sort of plan in place. So if this child is motivated by attention, then the attention should come at any time when the child starts doing things that are more in the direction of the behaviors that are wanted. And attention should not be there at the moments when they're doing these problematic behaviors. Now, I know that's an oversimplification because some problematic behaviors beg attention if they're putting people at a risk for safety or they're disrupting the environment. But even in that case, I would recommend putting some sort of behavioral plan in place that predicts that the child has these sorts of behaviors, and when they happen, that there's a way to kind of keep everybody else safe and to keep whatever the school structure in place is going. And so almost to have this child a little bit of away from the group when they're reacting in this way, away from the group and not getting special one-on-one attention.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's kind of difficult to do sometimes, as I'm sure.
Yes. I didn't say this is easy. And I mean, I've seen schools where you might have very limited space. So where are you supposed to go? And that creates a big problem. It's hard.
All right. Question about a 13-year-old who has executive function challenges. And as it gets worse, it's gotten worse over time. Rewards don't seem to work, but when you tell him to refocus with executive function, he gets really frustrated. And this parent would appreciate any tips you might have along this line dealing with executive function.
Yeah. Just to say a word on one little piece of that it gets worse over time. I mean, that could happen for a lot of reasons. But, yeah, a lot of times with children who have executive functioning problems, as they get older, there simply are more demands on them academically, in school, socially, and in the home environment. And so sometimes it gets worse over time because sort of their executive functioning difficulties sort of are making it harder and harder as demands get higher. So that can be really tough. And I would actually, in a way, I think that the solutions are very much in the spirit of the talk today, where what you would like to do is to try to identify the areas that are the most problematic for this child and start to engage them in discussions and come up with plans for them that sort of identify where the problems are and get them trained on starting to generate solutions. Because over the long term, a child with executive functioning becomes a young adult with executive functioning problems, and we're going to want them to be able to manage that. They know that these problems exist, so they have to start structuring their environment and making plans. So we're trying to teach them that for their long-term functioning.
And at 13, it seems that it would be time to definitely start that.
Yes, and one of the things that's possible is if the child's really affected by it, then it might be useful to give them accommodations that make it so things are not as hard for them. Because if this is the child where the 2 hours of homework that the other kids get every night takes 5 hours, I mean, you're really putting them in a tough position. And so you might want to consider what you can do to make things a little bit easier, and that clears the space to work on these skills.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. A 6-year-old that happens to have TS and rage outbursts if he awakens in the middle of the night, and when he is awakened after or when he's awakened after falling asleep in the car. He doesn't normally have them when he gets up in the morning, but when he does wake up from these short sleeps or in the middle of the night, the outbursts can last for 1 to 2 hours. He's inconsolable, will use hurtful words, throw things, has a real kind of breakdown, I would say. And your thoughts on that would be really helpful.
Right. Did you say the age of the child?
6 years.
6 years old. And this is, and I don't know if this was clear, but is it that the child, when they are woken up, or if they happen to wake up?
It says if he awakens in the middle of the night, or, which apparently happens frequently, so he wakes up, or when he's awakened after falling asleep in the car. So they're probably short sleep sessions that, he either wakes up from in the car intentionally or on his own in bed.
Yeah. So this it sounds it sounds like it could be multiple different things, but I'm imagining a child who, in a way, is having like a night terror situation. I don't quite know. It's not as much my area of expertise, but I would try to institute plans that make that have the child feel safer. I'm glancing at my bookshelf right now. So I have actually a short parent workbook that I think is really great for sleep-based difficulties, especially if it's limited to sleep. And the author of it is Durand, is D-U-R-A-N-D, and it's entitled When Children Don't Sleep Well. And it really gives like a wealth of information on sort of different things to try and how to prioritize the things. So one thing I recommend to the parent is that they get this. It's called a parent workbook. When children don't sleep well, parent workbook, and that they take a look at it. And I actually think it could probably answer some of these questions a little bit better than I could.
All right, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Have a question about transitioning. Transitioning from video games. You know, it could be, transitioning from TV, as in your example earlier. But, you give him a warning, but he doesn't want to, but no matter what happens, they're irritated when they have to stop doing what they like doing.
Yep. Yeah, this is extremely common. There are probably a lot of parents who are listening right now that are nodding their heads. The very principles that we were talking about apply. If this is a major problem area and it's your identified problem, then this could be a great opportunity to select it for this problem-solving process. So you basically, outside of the video game time, so outside of when the child wants to stop playing the video game, you start to engage them in a discussion of, I notice when you're playing video games and it's time to do something else that it's really hard for you to stop playing video games. What do you think happens? Getting the kid's point of view and basically engaging them in collaborative problem solving. Say, well, I'm worried if you don't go to bed on time, then you're going to be tired for school tomorrow, or I'm worried that if you play video games through dinner that you won't get to eat properly. I value family time, whatever it is, and then trying to engage the child around a discussion about that might be a good first option. I think a lot of times there's a lot of power struggles around video games because some kids were difficult in a lot of ways. Like that's the one time when they seem to be able to remain calm, but then to ask them to stop is hard. So it can be a really challenging area, but I think it applies in the same way that any of the examples do.
Okay. I have an incident here. It's an interesting one, and it's a little lengthy, so I will definitely try and be brief with it. But this parent is relating an incident where the child, was carrying a chair and broke a dish. And that simple thing, even though the parent said, don't worry about it, it's okay, it's no big deal, he started picking up the pieces, and, he threw the chair, threw the pieces. It turned into this enormous big escalation. It's like the parent's just frustrated on how best to handle it. And when you talk to him afterwards, apparently, and try to get him to say what he was experiencing or what happened, he gets frustrated with that. He doesn't want to be asked. He said, I don't know why, and so that's the brief version of that question.
Right. Well, so to make sure that I heard you correctly, that after the child, like say for example, broke a dish, do they either try to clean it up, or do they then take the pieces and begin breaking them into smaller pieces?
Well, he started picking up the pieces, and the mom says, sure enough, she kind of knew what was going to happen because he was apparently sorry that it broke, started picking up the pieces, and then called himself an idiot, and then it escalated into, throwing the chair and, to really getting out of control. And it's really hard to figure out how to manage that.
Right. Okay. Well, so two possible answers spring to mind, because the reality is in this situation is that you would want to really have a sense of kind of like what led to behaviors initially, and maybe it was a clumsy act that the child, say, dropped the dish, so it was an accident, but then the escalation happened from there. If that were the case, then I would wonder if there was sort of OCD around or anxiety issues with this child around doing things perfectly, doing things, being good, doing things well, and then when they have violated those sort of expectations of themselves, then that's hard to tolerate because it's very anxiety-provoking and frustrating, and then from there it sort of segues into an explosive outburst. And so if that was the case, then it might be useful to actually address the anxiety issues, which would probably be well done, I mean, I would think within
So start there.
with a with a therapist or something like that. And then on the other hand, I mean, a couple other just possibilities as if it's sort of, if there's a prior escalation that led to the child somehow is already upset about something at the moment that they're breaking the dish, even if it seems like an accident. So there'd be the question of, are there things that sort of happened before the dish got broken that could be sort of the identified problem situations, as opposed to the dish breaking itself being a problem situation? Mm-hmm. So if we identify sort of what else is involved in the situations where, say, something gets broken, then we could start to try to address those other things. Because from a certain point of view, saying, you know, I noticed that you get upset when a dish breaks that you broke, what's going on might not seem the best thing, because, and we don't know how often that happens. I would imagine that you'd want a more concrete situation in mind. The very last thing that I could think of is if the kid is very susceptible to sensory sensitivities, then perhaps like the sound and seeing the dish break and sort of things about that incident were actually inherently like a little bit flooding for the child and led to the outburst. So it could be multiple possibilities.
Okay. But you're right. It could have been something that happened previous to the actual dish break that could have initiated that.
Right. So the question, I guess, within that is, we imagine that there's some source to the upset. So the dish broke and the child did become upset, and now they don't want to talk about it because it's upsetting. Mm-hmm. But the task of the parent or the therapist or both is to try to figure out, you still actually need to understand like what happened, because if you don't have that understanding, then it's going to be really hard to start coming up with solutions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. All right. Question about the behaviors that you were describing to this parent don't sound particularly like rage attacks. They sound more like common temper tantrum, which is what her son experiences. So she had thought from other parents' comments that rage attacks were more like a caged animal response behavior that goes off like a switch and it's violent. So she's wondering, first off, kind of about those distinctions between what do you call a temper tantrum and where does it become this kind of a rage attack?
Right. So what I would say is that I personally would not draw a strong distinction between those two things. And the reason why is because I would actually see it more as existing on a scale. And different kids have different sort of tantrum repertoires. And some of them are more problematic than others. But I'm seeing them all as sort of the same type of phenomenon. Now, if you have a 2-year-old, like in my example, that's having a temper tantrum, we expect that all 2-year-olds have temper tantrums at times. But many fewer 8-year-olds have frequent temper tantrums, and teenagers and such things. It can still happen, but
so it more shifts into a different thing that's drawing that kind of attention then.
Right, and so some kids will escalate to different levels of behaviors, and so some will only do verbal behaviors, and their rages are limited to that. And believe you me, verbal behaviors can in and of themselves be very upsetting and disruptive to families.
What this mom goes on to say is that it seems to her that, you know, her son does get violent, and it seems that he can't release his mind from what he's become compulsive about. so it's a specific repetitive event that he's responding to, and he feels like his brain gets locked on that.
Right.
So it's, you know, I mean, it sounds OCD-ish to me.
Right.
And I'm not a therapist by any means, but that's what it sounds like to me.
Now, if I was a therapist, well, I am a therapist, but if I was in treatment with this child, it's that second thing that I would be more focused on, unless there was a big safety concern. I'm more focused on, you know, the child gets really stuck into their thoughts or what they need, and then they're starting to have these breakdowns and outbursts over that. Because I think that figuring out more about that is where you're going to be able to make proactive plans for change. You want to try to change things on the front end before the rages happen. Now, once a rage happens, so you're saying this child can become pretty physically aggressive and such things. I think different children have different repertoires of what they might do when they're upset, and that when they're upset, they will go ahead and carry those repertoires out. So a child who only yells and curses and cries is more likely to continue only yelling, cursing, and crying, whereas a child who's more frequently pushing and hitting is more likely to continue doing that. For the most part, I don't tend to believe in the caged animal reaction, and I've seen occasional things that you could argue against it. But I actually think that while there's a sense where the child is in an explosive outburst and can't control their emotions and raging, that within that there's also things that they'll do and won't do, and that there's sort of a bit of a sense of control. It's not that they're choosing overtly what they're going to do and not do, but I have walked into houses with children who have surprising rage behaviors and are punching holes in the walls and breaking doors, and you walked around and there's not a single broken window, and there'll be glass ornaments sitting out and about, and none of those are getting broken. And I think the reason why is because, in a way, the child is picking and choosing, and breaking a window seems like a worse thing to do than punching a hole in the wall. And so there's sort of some limit to the level, as opposed to a caged animal who's cornered and will be scratching and biting and really doing sort of more problematic things in a way.
Okay.
And so that's not to have dismissed the problematic level that behaviors and outbursts can get to, but I think to an extent that I don't tend to think of it as sort of absolute loss of control.
Okay.
It's just predictable patterns of behaviors that happen when outbursts occur.
All right, we've just about run out of time. I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay.
Now that we've talked about kids having outbursts and being uncontrollable and all of that, it's a very interesting question that how do you help a child save face after an outburst? Like, how do you manage the fallout of something that unfortunate?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. A tough question, but a wonderful question. And beyond sort of the answer of trying to reduce the outburst, sort of leaving that to the side for a moment, the thing that I would really try to do is to, in some ways, normalize that this happens with a lot of children. So try to encourage the child to see that. But more importantly is to try to separate the child's view of themselves as a person from the moments where they're going into rage. So there's a difference between them, the child, and this thing that happens to them, the rages. And you can do this with OCD, and you can do this with tics, and it's a really important thing to do, is that as you want to externalize these symptoms that are a little bit out of their control. So a child is not their tics. They're a child who has tics, but they're defined by the other things they do, that the sports that they like, or the books, or the games, or those sorts of features define who the child is. And so to really focus the child in on the positive attributes and to basically coach them in not viewing themselves that way, And in therapy, I mean, ways that you could do that. I don't know the age of this child, but you could have them like draw a picture of their rage when they're in that state. Give it a name that's different from them and start referring to it as something that's not them. So it's not their internalized sense of themselves.
Okay. Well, I think we are out of time, so I am going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Dr. Ewbank, for your presentation this evening, and I'm going to turn the events back to Kelly.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining our webinar on understanding and responding to behavioral difficulties and rage behaviors. There is an exit survey which should show on your screen as you exit. Please fill out the evaluation on the exit survey. The discussion board will be is open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that weren't covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the website. Our next presentation, The Impact on Marriage and Family in Raising a Child with Neurological Issues, being presented by Gail Foreman, is scheduled for March 23rd, 2011. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Ewbank, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for